Is the UN really the guardian of world peace, or just an expensive talking club? When we look back at Bosnia in the 1990s, Rwanda, Syria, and now Gaza, one question echoes louder than ever: has the UN collapsed as a global institution? If the Security Council cannot prevent genocide, cannot stop war crimes, cannot even enforce its own resolutions, then why does it exist? The United Nations was born out of the ashes of World War II. In 1945, the promise was simple: never again. Never again would the world sit idle while millions were killed. Never again would international law be powerless against aggression. But 80 years later, the reality is grim. Civilians in Bosnia were slaughtered under UN watch. Gaza burns today while resolutions pile up like useless paper. And here we must ask, as President Erdogan once said, is the world really bigger than 5? Or will the permanent members of the Security Council keep the planet hostage to their own interests? So we must ask, do we really need the UN anymore, or has it failed beyond repair? The Bosnia failure. Let's rewind to Bosnia, 1995. The UN had promised a safe zone in Srebrenica. Thousands of Bosniak civilians sought refuge under the UN's blue helmets. They believed those flags represented safety. But when Serbian forces advanced, the UN peacekeepers stood aside. The result? Over 8,000 men and boys were massacred in just a few days. The world called it genocide. Survivors called it betrayal. And yet the UN called it a tragedy. What credibility can an organization have if it cannot protect civilians in areas it declared as safe? Rwanda, Iraq, Syria. Bosnia wasn't an isolated mistake. In Rwanda, 1994, the UN again failed. 10 peacekeepers were killed, and the UN withdrew instead of reinforcing. The genocide went on, over 800,000 people butchered in 100 days. In Iraq, 2003, the United States invaded without UN approval. The so-called international system was powerless to stop a war that reshaped the Middle East. In Syria, endless vetoes by Russia and China blocked any real action. Barrel bombs fell, chemical weapons were used, civilians starved, but the UN kept meeting, debating, and issuing statements. Is this the system we still call the world's hope for peace? Gaza, the final blow? And now, Gaza. For months, the world has watched as thousands of civilians, women, children, entire families, were killed. Hospitals bombed. Refugee camps flattened. Humanitarian aid blocked. The UN General Assembly votes overwhelmingly for ceasefires. The world demands accountability. But in the Security Council? One veto from the United States blocks everything. So what is the UN really? An institution of justice, or a prisoner of great power politics? The blue flag is flying in New York, but in Gaza, it looks powerless, almost invisible. If the UN cannot even enforce basic humanitarian law, can we still call it necessary? The structural rot. The UN's collapse is not only about Gaza. It's about its very design. The Security Council is built on inequality. 5 permanent members, America, Russia, China, Britain, and France, hold the ultimate veto. If one disagrees, nothing moves. One country can silence the will of 190 nations. And that's exactly what we've seen: the United States shielding Israel, Russia shielding Assad, China shielding Myanmar. How can an institution that preaches democracy operate under permanent dictatorship by 5 states? A club for powerful nations. Let's be honest, the UN has become a theater. Leaders give speeches, ambassadors trade accusations, and meanwhile, wars rage outside. It spends billions every year, yet fails in its central mission, peace. Yes, the UN still runs schools, refugee camps, and aid agencies. But so do NGOs. Do we really need a bloated bureaucracy for that? The uncomfortable truth is that the UN today is less a guardian of humanity, and more a shield for the powerful. Can the UN be reformed? Some argue reform is the answer. Expand the Security Council. Limit veto powers. Give more ground to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But here's the catch, the same 5 powers must agree to give up their privilege. And history shows, they won't. Why would Washington, Moscow, or Beijing voluntarily weaken their grip on global decision-making? Reform sounds good in speeches, but in reality, it's dead on arrival. A world without the UN? So what happens if the UN fades into irrelevance? Would chaos erupt, or would new systems emerge? Already, we see alternatives. Regional alliances like the EU, African Union, or ASEAN taking bigger roles. Coalitions of the willing stepping in when the UN fails. Calls for an independent European army or a stronger role for the International Criminal Court. Maybe peace in the 21st century doesn't need one giant institution in New York. Maybe it needs a network of regional powers holding each other accountable. So, back to the question. Is the UN still a necessity after Gaza? If necessity means legitimacy, strength, and the ability to protect civilians, the answer is no. How Israel is able to resist to the all-world with cut-off humanitarian aid, food and water for Gaza? The hottest question is Security Council protecting Gaza or Israel? The UN has collapsed under the weight of its own promises. But if necessity means symbolism, a flag we wave when we feel powerless, then maybe yes, it still has a role. The tragedy is this, when history judges Bosnia, Rwanda, Syria, and Gaza, it will not only judge the perpetrators. It will also judge the United Nations, the institution that stood by, watched, and did nothing. And that may be its greatest failure of all. For the next insightful episode, please share your like and subscribe to channel.